Good afternoon, and welcome to the Sunday Times Live Dialogues, where we provide our readers with insight into key problems facing our country. My name is Nicki Gules, and I'm an assistant editor at the Sunday Times. Today heralds the start of the 16 Days of Activism for No Violence Against Women and Children campaign, and we are dedicating this event to a discussion on child abuse. So, how much do we abuse our children? Just today, we heard the news of how an ANC PEC member in Mpumalanga was reinstated to his position, and he's out on bail for allegedly raping his twin daughters. We also heard of a woman who was allegedly raped by her swimming coach decades ago and has been trying to bring her case to the attention of the authorities. So here are some figures. According to the crime statistics tallied between April last year and March this year, there were 42,348 contact crimes reported to have been committed against children. And this translates to one child becoming a victim every 20 minutes. An average of 29 children were reported assaulted every day in South Africa in that statistical period, and 20 children a day were assaulted with the intent to do grievous bodily harm. 47 children were raped every day in the country. Share your questions for our panel in our live chat, and we'll get to them later in the discussion. I'd like to briefly introduce our panel. I'm very fortunate to have with me today. We have Dr. Shaheda Omar, Director of the Teddy Bear Clinic, who's worked with abused children for more than 20 years. We have Advocate Carin Coetzee, the Senior Public Prosecutor at the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit, who has prosecuted many child abuse cases over the years. We also have Luke Lamprecht, the Advocacy Manager and Child Protection Specialist for Women and Men Against Child Abuse. And we have author and activist Deon Wiggett, who investigated and hunted down the pedophile who allegedly raped him as a child and collected his victims. So, round one. The World Health Organization defines child abuse as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress. Now, this includes physical, sexual, and emotional abuse of children, as well as neglect and exploitation. Luke, can we start with you, please? So child abuse is really wide-ranging. What is the scope of child abuse complaints that your organization receives? What are you seeing?
Look, I think we need to look at two primary things. I mean, the first is that there is acts of omission. So we're getting lots of things not for children. So we've had a lot of very good findings in the High Court this year around, for example, mothers who did not protect their children when the fathers or caregivers beat the children to death. So that's something not done for children, because us as adults, we all have a duty to not harm children, and then we have a duty to positively protect them. And then the second, obviously, is the acts of commission. And the acts of commission have become a bit more complex this year because the Constitutional Court, for example, has said that the defense for corporal punishment of reasonable chastisement is no longer a defense. And the Children's Act the amendments are attempting to deal with issues of corporal punishment. So things done to children are starting to expand in scope, and we see both the acts of commission and the acts of omission.
That's very interesting, especially the so-called the smacking laws. Now, Shaheda, child abuse has been lumped in with gender-based violence and femicide for the 16 Days campaign. Why are these two concepts so linked? What are the commonalities and what are the differences? Shaheda, you're on mute.
It's important to appreciate and recognize that where there's domestic violence, gender-based violence, where we're seeing intimate partner violence, we are also seeing a co-occurrence of child abuse. More than 50% of children who have been victims of abuse, any shape or form of abuse, have come from an environment where there is domestic violence. And this seems to be an ongoing challenge. And what was prevalent during lockdown and even thereafter, the aftermath of that, is we have seen a lot of children and mothers coming forward seeking support, where children have been victims directly or indirectly, and that's also recognized as maltreatment of children. So the government, I think President Ramaphosa, looked at violence against women and violence against children as a national pandemic, as a national strategic plan to address GBV. And I think this is something that we need to look at, the commonalities that both women and children are victims. They're both in the position or the dynamic of power in terms of patriarchy, in terms of toxic masculinity, and feeling quite powerless, helpless, and subjected to an environment of humiliation and fear of reprisal, fear of being rebuked, and also the stigma that is associated, the intimidation, the coercion that they are subjected to is common for both women and for children. So I think that's what we need to look at in terms of commonalities. But the areas of differences that we need to identify is that in the one case, we are finding that the victims of domestic violence are adults and the victims of child abuse are minors. So that the dynamic of power and the dynamic of being heard and responded to, of course, there is the shift in the power balance. And this is what we need to recognize. But I think we need to be also very clear that we cannot dilute the voices of children and lump them together with the voices of women. And I think that having sat on the interim steering committee of gender-based violence, that has been a huge ongoing battle where we have raised the issue around not lumping the two together, but giving the voiceless a voice and hearing children. And I think what Luke said about, in terms of provision of services and prevention, I think participation of children's voices is also key.
Mm. Yeah, the agency. And also a key difference is that children may not be economically active. They don't have any means to support themselves. Yeah. Now, Deon, you would have Karina to thank for the rape cases no longer prescribing, and the fact that it is possible now to prosecute offenders decades after the crimes were committed. Now, you had to mine your own memory, as well as the memories of others, to build a case against your abuser. In many cases, these were very many years after the rapes occurred. How difficult was this to do?
Well, massively, obviously, in the sense that so for me to take back the power that was taken from me, I had to do an investigation myself. I had to figure out by myself why this had happened and why a particular man had come onto my path and why that man even existed or exists, and what environments and how he was enabled. So the tricky thing was naturally that I had to find other guys who fit the same profile, who did fit the same profile back then, and then have to find a way to make contact by going, "Hi, I'm Deon. Hey, were you ever raped by Willem Breitenbach? I was totally raped by Willem Breitenbach." I mean, is obviously not what you can say. So, I mean, you're talking here to guys who have been groomed. So they, when suddenly a stranger appears, the last thing you want is for them to have a transferential reaction. And so it was, so to me, approaching the guys was almost like ungrooming them. Because, little bit by little bit, I had to demonstrate that I can be trusted and that it's, this is a safe place. But a lot of it also then brought up some of my own issues, which is becomes quite a bit to juggle with sometimes, because like a guy would tell me the story of his own entanglement with Willem Breitenbach, and then that would spark a memory in me, and like I kind of have to pretend to be a journalist and a very professional person with like a clear head and yeah, so it did get hard in that sense. But you know, victims of or survivors of sexual abuse are very often incredibly pleasant people to talk to. I mean, it's like, you know, it is the upside of having your boundaries erased, is that, you know, very colorful conversation. So I mean, it can be a pain in the ass to get the guys to trust you, but what they do, I mean, it's a really special thing.
Yes. Shaheda, continuing from that discussion, I mean, memory is a very tricky thing to work with, right? So what problems do you encounter with securing convictions against abusers of children? And in addition to that, can our police and judicial system do better? And what would you like them to improve on?
Indeed, Nicki, they can do a lot more. So memory is critical, and I think Karina and all my learned colleagues will allude to this, is that children or victims of trauma generally, when they have been inflicted with deep wounds, whether it's sexual abuse or other emotional abuse, physical abuse, often there's you know, a kicking instinct that kicks in, where there's this defense mechanism where they dissociate themselves from the actual trauma. They separate themselves. They actually numb that pain. So it's a preventative and protective mechanism. And what we are finding in the courts, you know, where children sometimes would give a statement and then, of course, go to court, and then you know, having received therapy during this process, where they've received ongoing supportive counseling, feeling more in control and more in charge of their lives, then there might be additional information that is provided within the testimony period. And of course, immediately this is brought into disrepute, discredited, because there's additional information provided. But I think something that we find, which is a common characteristic, is there's fragmentation of information. So sometimes children will remember bits and pieces and will provide that throughout the process. But with the ongoing support, suddenly they would provide more detailed information. So initially you would get that empty sandwich syndrome, where there's peripheral information provided, and then more in-depth information where the middle becomes more fleshy and, of course, more meaty. And this is often a concern that, of course, the defense would ride on and discredit the witness or the victim. And I think this is difficult to secure convictions. But to begin with, children's evidence is often viewed with caution. And because there are no other witnesses, often there aren't witnesses present. This is, again, a harsh reality that one needs to deal with and fight. You know, it's an ongoing battle to secure convictions. But I must say that we have actually made some progress, which is not sufficient.
And what can the authorities do better, in your view?
So I just had a meeting with my team on Friday, and we talked about this challenge, where we're finding that as we speak, that children are actually called into consultation the very morning they have to go and testify in court. So prosecutors are still bringing in children just before they have to testify. I think that is certainly unacceptable. Furthermore, we are still finding that children are not receiving court preparation. Every child that needs to testify should be placed in a position of power, support, and equipped and enabled to be able to identify who's who, to alleviate their fears and anxieties around the daunting court processes, because courtrooms are not built for children. And I think that compounds everything, because children are not aware of what to expect. And sometimes children will even change their stories in court because they've been repeatedly asked the same question. And we know children, when they're placed under pressure, feel, I'm not being believed, so I need to change my story. You know, and these are challenges that we are currently, as we speak, facing, when we should not be faced with these challenges, and children should not be subjected to this kind of intervention or approach in the court systems. So our courts are still failing our children.
And the police?
So again, in terms of police, I think the lack of sensitivity, the responses, and we cannot paint all police or prosecutors with the same brush. There are pockets of excellence, but I think those are few and far between. So the kind of questioning where we have found that police would force a child to go to the crime scene, or police would actually take a child in the same vehicle with the alleged perpetrator to the crime scene. So the lack of insensitivity, I think, is actually horrific, and one cannot even begin to understand the impact, the effects it would have on a child.
Karina, following from that, can you tell us about, just what it takes to bring a child abuse case to court, and what is the conviction rate? Is Karina with us?
Child abuse can vary. Child abuse is very wide.
Yes, we lost you there for a minute.
Child abuse is a very wide. Child abuse is a very wide description for several different types of offences. You get sexual offences, and then that is child abuse, and then what is noteworthy in terms of sexual child abuse is the fact that it is also considered sexual abuse of a child if you allow a child to be sexually abused by another person. So you can also be convicted on that basis. And then, of course, it's physical abuse. You need completely different evidentiary material for the two different cases. For instance, in terms of the assault GBH, child abuse, or being physically assaulted, is children under the age of 5. In other words, children that only have access to their caretakers. They don't have access to teachers, or they don't go to preschools, etc. In other words, my experience also is with these physical abuse children. It's strange, but the parents normally had support of other family members. But despite that, the baby ended in a few weeks with critical injuries at hospital. Of physical abuse of children, distressing is the fact that it's so very seldom being investigated as an assault GBH, and that we only come to know about these babies if the injuries are so serious that a medical intervention is required, or otherwise the baby dies. So these are the only times that we find out about it. You're going to utilize your baby is 10 weeks old. So your medical evidence and your professionals are extremely important. In fact, that is what you base your case on. Luke can attest to that, since he's been a witness on many occasions, as well as late Professor Jacqueline. But what we've done in terms of, and that should really, what Dr. Omar said about the treatment of children, I do, and it is so. You cannot consult with your child on the day of evidence. Now that I'm in national office, I do my cases in different courts. And I know, even for me, I'm not even middle-aged, I'm old now, and it's anxious. It creates anxiety with me if I haven't met my presiding officer before the day of the trial. I need to know who so you can imagine, for a child that hasn't even met the prosecutor, don't know which court it's going to be, how the child is going to be treated. The intermediary can only be met on the day of the trial. So yes, those are, and it will impact negatively on the credibility of the child. One thing I would suggest that we can do to improve definitely our investigation and presentation of evidence cases where all the expert comes together. And they, Luke was the instigator of a case and a death review team for Johannesburg. But since I left Johannesburg, I doubt it's still going on, but Luke can inform us here. We, as I say, professionals, and even I did a baby case. Baby was one of the twins, 2 months old. The twin sister had passed away due to vicious abuse, and the baby boy had severe fractures, but he never cried. So that was one of the defenses of his parents, is the fact, how were they supposed as laypersons to know that this baby was injured, considering that he does. And then I had to call a psychosocial expert, who better than I would. But yeah, I then had to present the psychosocial expert to come and indicate how traumatic it is actually to find a baby that would not cry. That means every time that the baby cried, the baby was punished, or that caused the baby to experience pain. So the baby doesn't see crying as getting his needs being met through crying. Indeed, he gets punished if he cries. So hungry. He didn't cry when he was wet. That was the case that turned it down for me, that where I became specializing more in physical abuse of children than in emotional abuse. But yes, with these, and we have death review teams for KZN and Western Cape, but just on physical abuse of children. But yes, I would really see special or case review teams for the age, or whether it's a sexual offense. And as I say, that would take us a long way to 100% of conviction rate, and to treat our children with the respect that they need. Another thing that I can quickly add, I'll talk fast, I know we don't have much time. Another thing that I can maybe just add is also we must, as prosecutors and as police investigators, we rely too heavily on our victims to promote the case or to present the case. We must spend more time in collecting, corroborating, and rebuttal evidence. We can't just rely on our 4-year-old. And as I say, sometimes we can track on cell phone tracking. We can utilize more investigative methods rather than just putting that child in the box and relying solely on that child's evidence. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly valuable information, Carina. Now, Deon, you tracked about 50 of your alleged rapist victims. I have to say alleged because he's in court and hasn't been found guilty yet. What is the nature of the evidence that you have obtained to ensure that he actually got arrested and appeared in court at all? And tell us a bit about where your case is right now.
So in the course, I did a podcast called My Only Story, that I've turned into a book now. And those kind of, these cases always start off with the question, what is the evidence? Because we're talking here about something that was done in private. I mean, people were not there. You can't normally rape children in public. So in the end, the survivors are the evidence. And because I'm not 4 years old, I'm 40, but I'm still nervous about going to court and not being believed. So I didn't want to be in that position. So I figured by building up a whole bunch of witnesses that span decades, that all have a similar story to tell, I mean, it's not like I have a little blue dress that I was wearing that has a semen stain on that I can submit to the court. But I can say this is exactly everything that happened to me. And if all of these other guys tell the same story, surely it becomes impossible not to believe us. So it was kind of born out of the conviction that, pedophiles, these men who hunt children, don't do it as a one-off, like, suddenly one afternoon they decide, Deon seems quite rapey this afternoon, let's go for that. It is a pattern that just, perpetuates itself eternally. So in order to, because I wanted to make a media stink about him, in order to clear the hurdle to defamation, we had to have an overwhelming amount of evidence to defame Willem Breitenbach and say that he is a child rapist, which he is. I'm a maverick journalist. I'm alleging these things without saying so. And then in the course of my investigation and in the course of the News 24 investigation that came with it, in the end, I stopped counting after more than 50 guys told me what happened. So all 50 guys are not going to trial, but if a guy phones and tells me a story that is precisely consistent, does it only count if he can write it down? So for the purposes of trying to track what happened, we, of the guys who came forward, maybe a quarter or a part of the court case, but I'm not going to say, well, for the purposes of my cruel data keeping, I'm not going to count your incident because you can't quite remember everything that happened, or you don't want to write it down. Obviously this happened. So yeah, the case, to answer your question about the progress of the case, it is being postponed regularly in the Cape for further investigation. These things take a long time, but the charges are increasing and all of that. And I'm actually quite enjoying all of the delays. He's staying in his mother's tiny house on the Afrikaner Garden route. It's horrible there. He's been in a cage for a year already now. So I don't mind the delays, but that's obviously just a personal reflection.
Luke, if I may come to you now, so I'm going to ask you quite a few questions. If we can go back to what Karina said about the structures that you had put in place to experts to prepare for court, you shook your head when she asked if it was continuing. So can you tell us what they were supposed to have done, and why they're no longer with us?
Yes, if I could make two comments. I think the first is that the review panel was largely personality driven as opposed to process driven. And unfortunately, that is a lot of what this system is. So if you look at the broad child protection system, we all know we've got a great constitution, we're signatories to the UN Convention, we've got fantastic progressive laws, all of these kinds of things. However, within the system, there is a very personality-based response to these systems. And if your personality is one like Carin and myself and Dr. Nell, we come together, and the pediatricians involved, we come together and we say, we feel really strongly that dead children should be honored and remembered, and we are the only voices left for those dead children. Therefore, we must be these illuminated witnesses where we need to come together to honor the deaths of these children. And the only way to do that is to, in some way, witness their lives. And the only place you can witness that really is in court, to be very frank, where we all come and we say, this is what happened to the child, help the court understand the very complex cases, the extremely complex medicals that are associated with it, and give these dead children a voice. So when the personalities started shifting in the system, the process sort of fell apart as the personality shifted. And that's a very sad thing. The police are a problem, and I'll just call it what it is. And they are a problem because the mandate that relates to deceased children shifts continuously. So when the cases were in the media, suddenly we became a sort of not a priority, but like a high profile kind of set of cases. The minute we had high profile cases, they dedicated us individual police officers. Those police officers used to come to our meetings. The minute it died in the media, so did the attendance of the police officer. So that's been a real challenge. Then if a child is abused and lives, they're with the Family, Child and Sexual Offences Unit. The minute they die, they end up with an inquest officer. The inquest officers, interestingly, have been our best investigators thus far. So we have had, in our last 3 convictions in the High Court, which, I mean, I've given evidence in 3 murder cases in the space of about 6 weeks. Children between the ages of 5 months and 5 years who've all been murdered by their caregivers over a period of time. And I've gone in aggravation of sentencing to assist the court to understand the nature of the abuse. In some cases, there were surviving children. In other cases, there weren't surviving children. And the big thing is that those police officers were just dedicated human beings who said, I have to do the best by these children. They were not specialized family, child, and sexual offences investigators. The prosecutors were not specialized. They were the High Court advocates, all of them. Brilliant. And the judges were people who wanted to hear the evidence so that they could make the best possible decision. So specialization doesn't translate into better investigations. In fact, on the contrary, we have had cases with the police now particularly in one of the swimming cases you referred to earlier, where the police officer, who's a family, child, and sexual offences police officer, has made statements to the victim's father, such as, you can be sued for making this case. You can, if you come forward with this case, there's going to be issues because there is no evidence. And therefore, you should maybe rather consider there is a kind of a settlement of around 100,000 Rand. Please take the 100,000 Rand so that you can move on with your lives. Oh, and by the way, you also don't want to traumatize your child by putting your child through the system. So there's a level of disincentive that is made around the disclosure of abuse that is deeply, and that's by the specialists. And we've actually, in our child murder cases that Carin is referring to, we have found that when we had the team, if the team created a good docket, actually the people who investigated the good docket was your average inquest police officer.
That's fascinating. And tell us about the case that was in the news today. A rape survivor who says that she was raped between the age of 10 and 16 by her swimming coach. How many years ago was that? And can you give us any further details about where the case is at now?
Right, so I can't tell you much more than we did in the press conference yesterday, because it was just yesterday. So there hasn't been much progress since yesterday. But the important thing is that this victim came forward in 2003 and attempted to make a case, and this was prior to both the Frankel 8 case and the Bob Hewitt case, which Carin was instrumental in. And there was very much a different attitude at that stage towards adult survivors of cases years later. And then she came forward again now in 2020. And what happened was Swimming, well, let's be very fair, it's actually the head of Swimming South Africa, not the whole of Swimming South Africa, who kind of just basically silenced it. And that's really one of the big issues we're fighting. Interestingly, within that context, because the coach was not named, we had 2 other sets of disclosures, because people were saying, is this the coach that abused me? So now we've got 3 cases running with in total 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 victims and 3 coaches. So all cases are currently either at the reported phase. So all of them are reported. So in other words, they all have a CAS number. Not all of the victims have made statements. The one that you are referring to with the 40-year-old case, that is with the senior public prosecutor in the KZN region, and we are waiting a decision on further investigation, whether they're going to prosecute, etc. The other 2 cases, the one is the one I'm referring to, where the police officer seems to constantly dissuade the father from pursuing the case, and his daughter was only 15. She's only 16 now. This happened last year. So this was constant dissuading, and always saying, just take the docket to the prosecutor. You can't, as an individual police officer, decide on what it is that this case does and doesn't do. Do your job and send it to the prosecutor. Same as Swimming South Africa. Give the evidence that you got in your independent investigation by lawyer and give it to the police. So people do their own things internally. And if we are not going to use the laws that were given to us, we are making a mockery of our system. And the more we don't use the system that is before us, we can't challenge it because we don't know what's wrong with it. And the more we don't use it and don't report things, we can't resource it because we don't know how many cases we need to resource.
Indeed. Luke, thank you for that. Shaheda, can I ask you, what impact has this year's lockdown had on the incidence of child abuse? Has it increased, as we've heard?
So, home is the place of hope. Home is the place of safety and protection. That's what we all believe. Unfortunately, what we saw unveiling during the lockdown and even after is that was the very place where children have been in imminent danger, have been faced with threats, and have been actually victims of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and even sexual abuse. And what we are seeing now, the aftermath of that, is where children are coming out of the closets, reaching out for support, where children are now accessing school, because during the lockdown, obviously, all the restriction of movement prevented children from seeking any kind of support outside of the home environment. I think the reality was there was fear of being stopped by police officers, by law enforcement, and of course, fear of further abuse within the home environment. And I think something that I want to bring to the attention of everybody is that, yes, whilst there were 24-hour facilities, your hotlines, your child lines, this prevented children that previously had access to devices were in an unfortunate position where they were not able to access that kind of support because they were frozen, they were immobilized and trapped in the confines of their home and by the perpetrators themselves. So we certainly saw an increased incidence. I think in the first few weeks during lockdown, we received calls from neighbors, from mothers, reaching out for support for fear of their lives, fear of their children's lives. And being out there on the forefront, we also saw where children were subjected not only to physical abuse, but children succumbed to depression and suicide. And we saw an increased incidence of rape, opportunistic perpetrators living in the same neighborhoods where they knew their victims. And I think as the research confirms that it's always somebody that is either known or has a relationship. So these are the challenges that we faced during this period and we continue to face, where we are seeing that children continue to be marginalized and violated by the very people that are supposed to ensure their safety and protection. It's an implicit right for a child to be protected at home. Unfortunately, this is something that we have not seen. And we continue to see children being subjected to, remaining silent, but creating, I want to just say, Nicki, that I'm not a proponent of 16 days of activism, but I do believe that it has a place, because by giving it a higher platform, creating awareness, reaching out to people about their rights and responsibilities, and also making available resources and channels of communication certainly have propelled children, other victims, families to come forward and reach out for intervention and support.
No, exactly. Turning to Karina now. So we know there are a lot of things that we do in society in the normal course of business that is actually child abuse. So about the physical punishment that people mete out to their children, for which they were, as we said earlier, previously able to provide a defense that it was reasonable chastisement. Are there other things in this country that we do which we think are fine to do, but which are actually abuse under the law?
Yeah, in terms of chastisement, that did I mute?
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me again? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to have 5G. But many of it. In terms of that, it used to be a big problem where children would sustain serious injuries, and the parents would claim that it was just chastisement. And specifically, this case that went to the Concord, it was a case that I actually dealt with in Johannesburg, and the child was severely assaulted. I mean, severely. So I'm actually happy it was this case that went, so that we could get the ruling that we indeed did get, that is now considered assault GBH. What my biggest problem is in terms of assault is the fact that very often as I said, service providers don't always assess because of public awareness not lacking in terms of physical abuse. It so often goes undetected and wrongly identified. And at 2012, I don't think we've had any studies in the meantime, but a 2012 study indicated, that was a study that was done at all the mortuaries in South Africa, and it actually indicated that 53% of fatal child abuse was committed by the mothers. And as Luke had said, we're slowly changing the awareness of the community, because this year we have had already convictions where it was acts of omission. In other words, moms that did nothing to protect the children. So, yes, I think that is, very often mothers don't realize that is an offense, because there's a legal duty on them to protect their child. There are many incidences where I honestly feel a criminal offense has been committed, where I do find resistance from other service providers, and specifically other experts, as I said, with abuse, physical abuse, where very often the experts are not in agreement that parents should be punished for beating their children into hospital.
Sure. Luke, in this discussion so far, we've dealt with a lot of sexual abuse and serious assault, but neglect, as we've also said, constitutes abuse as well. In the lockdown, we've seen this. Some parents have no choice but to leave their children alone when going to work, and others are neglectful of the children because they don't have enough money to see to their needs. But there are incidences of willful neglect. Can you tell us more about the impact of child neglect?
Look, I think the important thing is, Carina's brilliant at answering this question. She has sort of a very sagely thing she says, where, for example, if you've got a parent who's begging at the street corner with their child, you want to charge them with endangering their child because of smoke inhalation, and the children are not going to school and they're standing in the sun. But if that mother left her child neglect and abandonment because now she's left her child at home. So, under-resourced people, we need to understand are victims in their own right of systemic neglect. So we need to very clearly distinguish between deliberate neglect, and the law does very clearly do it, deliberate neglect and systemic neglect. Now, I work in Hillbrow, so I run a boxing gym in the inner city, and we went from running a boxing gym to being a feeding scheme under lockdown and making sure people didn't get evicted, because those are the basic needs. It's food and shelter. And it was not due to a lack of will by the parents. They just lost their jobs, they lost their businesses, they lost income, they lost access to schools, they lost access to school feeding schemes. It was carnage in the city. And the thing to understand is that those parents are severely distressed by that. And their level of distress then leads them to obviously be stressed. And that stress then leads them to behave in ways that they ordinarily wouldn't behave in. And as a result, we saw complications in the relationships between parents increase. We had a big increase in GBV specifically between parents. And then obviously the difficulty in caring for your children when you're stressed and depressed and don't have money and a job and you stand a chance of being evicted, etc. So the systemic neglect we need to provide a supportive structure to. Whereas deliberate neglect, on the other hand, is something we need to hold people accountable for. Like the case I've just given evidence in, and the one I will be going back to court on the first to give supplementary evidence for the judge, is they've charged both the mother and the father with murder. And the reason the mother has been convicted of murder is because she didn't intervene when the father was murdering the child. And that is deliberately neglecting where you've chosen your role as a partner over your role as a mother. Okay. Subsequent to that, another child and got married while they were standing trial for murder, and he got the tattoo of the dead baby on his arm, the very child he murdered. So there's a level at which you can see the difference between that, which is deliberate neglect on the mother, and the systemic neglect. So to the effects of it, the effects of neglect on a systemic level are disastrous, because if children are not eating, children's basic functioning doesn't work properly. The most basic functioning, their bodies don't work properly, their brains don't develop properly in the very, very critical phases of neural pruning and neural development. The levels of stress hormones increase. The stress hormones cause cascades of really terrible things, which in adverse childhood experiences lead to shortened life expectancy, obesity, heart disease, immunological diseases, etc., etc. The deliberate neglect is singly possibly the worst thing you could do to a child. A child looks to their mother to protect them. I'm not discounting fathers, I'm just saying in general. The mother is the primary caregiver, and it's the mother's job to take in, like the mother bird, the world, and give it back to the child in a digestible format. They are the buffer to the world. The world is not a child-friendly place, and our city certainly is not a child-friendly place. And if you remove that buffer of the mother to the adverse childhood experience, you get a thing called toxic stress. So toxic stress is the stress that releases the set of ongoing stress hormones. So in other words, you'll have adrenaline if you get a fright, and then the adrenaline will subside, and it's like you've been on a roller coaster. But if your stress is constant, the person who's supposed to save you from being hurt or feed you, they're siding with the person who's hurting you, and you can't escape where you are. There is nothing worse. It is singly the worst thing you can do to a child, and it will affect their development for the rest of their life, including their health. I'm talking about basic health, like I said, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, etc., etc. So the effects are disastrous on children when they're deliberately neglected.
My word. Shaheda, can you tell us some of the lasting effects that child sexual abuse has on a victim?
So looking at the lasting effects, I mean, you know, there are so many, and of course, different children will respond differently to the exploitation, the violation, and the abuse. So what we are finding in our clinical interventions with children, where we are finding that some children are displaying eating disorders, some children are displaying mood disorders, which children that we've actually worked with from a very tender age and coming back. So when I talk about tender age, having worked with the victim at the age of 12, who was a victim of incest, and coming back to see me 12 years later, sitting with self-destructive, self-defeating behavioral patterns, where she's self-cutting, the self-mutilation that Deon spoke about earlier, and also perpetuating the cycle of violence, where she's got children of her own and now is subjecting them deliberately to physical abuse, and detaching herself from her own children because of her fear that she might sexually abuse her own children. So I just want to sketch the scene of lifelong implications, how it would impact on the relationship, where she's also violating her husband, where she's pushing him aside, but also physically assaulting him, because holding him responsible that all people that get close to you sexually are likely to violate you. But also looking at other effects, the depression that we're seeing, attempted suicide and completed suicides as well. Those are certainly things that is very worrisome, and it's a stark reality that we are faced with, that society as a whole gets affected because, as Luke identified, it's a systemic problem. We are talking about bullying, cyberbullying, children acting out at schools, adolescents acting out there, and then we're seeing the GBV situation. And a lot of it comes from these kind of adversities that has impacted on the well-being of many individuals and many families. And people, find that things that they enjoyed before, suddenly there's a total disinterest, a dissociation, detachment from life, and not appreciating anything that they participated and engaged in with such zest and vigor. So I think these are telltale signs that we need to look out for, but at the same time, we need to make a concerted effort to reach out where possible. Thank you.
Deon, can you take us through very briefly? I see we're running out of time, and I've been quite bad in my time management here. Deon, can you briefly take us through some of the lasting impacts that you've had?
What I've been relating to what Shaheda has been talking about, the way that I've understood for myself, and in my book, I do actually try to figure it out for myself, is why does it stuff you up so much? And the conclusion I came to is that what sexual abuse does is it, at that moment, strips you of the ability to feel safe in your own body. So the lesson becomes, wherever you take your body, you will not be safe, which is quite a life sentence. So in your attempt to cope with the incredible danger that your own body presents, I mean, people do many different things, but what you do not do is looking after yourself. So, I mean, because my body has gotten me into all of this trouble, but my brain has not. But I think therefore I am. So I don't have to eat healthy. I don't have to. I mean, I smoke a lot of weed quite openly, because it's a dissociative thing. I struggle with intimacy. I struggle with being surprised. I struggle. I need to know what I am letting myself in for before I do anything, because I just get nervous. I essentially want to get away from the world. I don't like answering phone calls. I don't have blue ticks on my WhatsApp, because if I have blue ticks on my WhatsApp, people will be able to see that I have read their message, and therefore they will know that I'm not responding, and therefore I have to respond. So I'm in a situation where I have to, respond. So I mean, I'm sure that parts of it is just my own neuroticism as well. But neuroticism is maybe like, the kindest way of describing what it really is about, because it's really surviving sexual abuse or sexual violence is really about surviving in the company of your own body and not allowing it to turn against you.
Now we have one question here relating to child abuse. I'm going to direct this to Carina. Carina, if you can hear us. So it's a question from Thelma. She says she's an 83-year-old grand aunt who has recently had the gut-wrenching experience of witnessing 4 children of her grand niece institutionalized because of her neglect and abandonment. And this is a drug-related issue, she says. She says that she's appalled and disgusted by the fact that there seems to be no law making abandonment of children by their parents a criminal offense. Now, Carina can tell us that there is, in fact, such a law. But maybe the problem here is with enforcement. Carina, over to you. Is Carina with us?
So there is indeed a law that prohibits the abandonment. I am. Yeah. Abandonment is defined as leaving a child without care of an adult, in the care of an adult, or leaving a child in the care of an adult for more than 3 months without a reasonable cause. But what I get the impression this question is more about is about the neglect, or what the person posting the question describe as abandonment. In other words, it's emotional abandonment. And I don't get the impression it's a physical abandonment. Mom is still there, parents are still there, they're just not caring for the child. Now that is indeed gross neglect, and as Luke had pointed out, deliberate neglect. If we can prove that it was deliberate neglect, then of course there will be consequences, and that would be criminal. Yes, and then in circumstances where the parents had spent income that could have been utilized to care for their children on drugs, could also indicate that it was deliberate neglect, and it could also relate to a criminal offense against them.
That's fascinating. So,
may I add briefly, Nicki? It's a very good question, because I did my internships in children's homes, and what happens is parents fall upon, and then they get their children removed and placed in care by the children's court, and then they disappear. So I think what that grandmother may be alluding to is the fact that once the children end up in care, the parents disappear. And our children's legislation looks at family preservation and reunification. And sometimes these poor children actually need to mourn the loss of their parents. And the children's court don't often refer the cases where the parents have abandoned when the children are in care, because the children are already in care. And the children see themselves as being punished because their parents don't come back because they're in care, the parents are doing whatever. And the children's court doesn't refer that for prosecution because the children are already in care, but they're abandoned in care.
Oh, that's fascinating. So in closing, I'd like us to provide some advice to our viewers about what they can do when they suspect a child is being abused, or how they can assist in the fight against child abuse. So I'd ask us to just do this really, really quickly. Deon, as a survivor yourself, what are the signs? Did you display any after what happened to you?
Well, looking back, yes, and I apologize for the aeroplane flying overhead. Looking back, yes, but I mean, it's not as if, when you're a child or a teenager, you quite understand what's going on, and that's why it's really becomes more important for parents to look out, because when you're a teenager, it's hard to say what is feeling usual and what is feeling unusual, but I am not an authority in any sense about the authorities. So I am going to wrap the rest of my time and give it to people like Shaheda and Karina and Luke, who actually know things.
Shaheda, what are the signs that parents should look out for, as well as teachers and neighbors? And what should they do after they spot them?
Important thing, Nicki, is that parents and caregivers, educators, everybody out there, if a child starts showing behaviors or signs that are not the regular behaviors that they see, where children are acting out, where they're acting, where there's disruptive behavior, they're behaving badly, they're behaving insane, where the behavior is just absolutely not understandable. I think there are reasons for that, because children are acting out. They're not able to speak out what they're actually feeling. They're not able to articulate. So look out for that mad, bad sadness that you are seeing in children, and unpack that and actually communicate. I think dialogue is key. Often that's what we fail to do. And we need to understand that we need to keep on checking out where our children are at. What is it that they're feeling? Where's that coming from? I think that's important. Communication is certainly key and can unveil a lot of challenges that children are faced with. And reporting, there are legal mandates. It's not a moral obligation. The Children's Act, the Sexual Offences Act, speaks to legal reporting, and failure to report is certainly a criminal offense.
Luke, what should neighbors do? So you hear a kid screaming next door, and you wonder what's going on. What do you do? What are you supposed to do? Who do you get in touch with? And how can even people who don't have, Like, for instance, I mean, I don't know of any ongoing acts of child abuse, yet I want to assist with the fight against it. What can I do?
Look, I think we need to recognize that it is our children we are protecting. And, sometimes parents end up in difficult positions where they're struggling with their children. They've got colicky babies, they're losing their mind, they want to throw their babies out of buildings, and they don't mean badly. Other times they do intend. So we must understand that the reporting of child abuse is an attempt to evoke a set of services for children. If those services are to imprison people, so be it. If those services are to give those people help and support, so be it. But you do need to go forward. And the complexity of it is it does need to be reported to social development, other issues to the police. And you do need to do it in a way that you don't make accusations, but you request an investigation. That also stops you being sued. It also stops you, it also stops people saying, oh, well, you saying I'm doing this. No, I'm not. I'm reflecting that your child seems distressed and you battling. I reported this in order to open up a basket of services. How people can be correct. How people can be involved is do what you are good at. So if you are a teacher, keep an eye on children. If you are a pastor, make sure that the other pastors are behaving themselves. If you're a swimming coach, keep an eye on the children and call your mates out if they're not doing the right thing by children. Even by swearing at them and pulling them by the hair because they're not doing properly, and the elite athletes who drive children too hard. Call your people out, because if we call the people out, the motto that I live by is, which it ends with me, my generation should end this nonsense. Because when I grew up, there was no language for this. There is now, so there's now no excuse. And you need to call your own people out.
And Karina, finally, when the case does make it to court, what can caregivers or teachers of the community do to help you ensure a successful prosecution?
Well, I think the first aspect is really correct identification. That all the previous speakers has referred to. In other words, believe the child. If the child makes a disclosure to you, believe the child. I also find it very important to make community and service providers understand that we can't stereotype. Do not, and I find it very often, especially with child abuse cases, where even colleagues, and I mean, now we're talking learned people here, would tell me, but they're so nice, they would never do that. And I have to, so, I mean, that's where stereotyping can really tank a case. And I must say, one of the most evil perpetrators I've ever dealt with was the Sunday rapist who killed his last victim that was 16 years old. And she was the oldest of his victims, but in any event, evil, evil man. And the one thing that everyone said about him is what a nice, charming man he was. And he was also very involved in the church with the youth because he was so good with children. So yes, that is the best I can. The best advice I can give is to my colleagues as well as to the community is don't stereotype. Anyone is capable. As Luke said, there might be a certain set of circumstances in your life that motivates you to behave. You might not behave in that way. So therefore, we want to distribute services to you. And if that does not help, then of course, a criminal prosecution can follow. But it's not, we don't want to report this and make sure that every child abuse case is investigated simply because we're so desperate to see parents in prison. That's not so. That is, as Luca pointed out, is to put a stop to what is happening to our children, which is impacting on everything, on our economy. It impacts on gender-based violence. It impacts on family cohesion. Yes, so if we can put a stop to this, and that would be fantastic. And what we also need is to work multidisciplinary. We need every expertise on board to ensure, as I said, relying exclusively on our victims. Thank you.
Well, Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to thank all our fantastic panelists for your time and your valuable insights and practical advice. The recorded discussion will be made available in the thank you emailer, which will be sent after the discussion. So please do keep an eye out for it. And wishing you all a productive 16 days of activism and a safe festive season. Thank you.